Hello and welcome back to the online classroom that we have created. Today I have Karin with me again, and I have been talking with Karin about explaining a little bit more the context of systemic traumatology, what that means, a little bit more understanding so you can get a taste of her background and her vast understanding and knowledge of trauma, because it's a word that I have noticed that I see on social media a lot lately, and it's, well, we'll talk about it in as Karin talks about, kind of the buzzword right now is trauma, especially with the coronavirus and what's happening in the world with restrictions on all levels. And so we're going to go right into a little bit more explanation of what this means. So Karin, could you kind of give us a better view of what we're listening to when we hear you, and so we can better understand this?
Yes, so thank you for being with me and having me with you again today. And the way I want to do this, I want to get us, I want to share my screen, and I want to get us into a handful of slides. I'm a very visual person, and it helps me to see images and to understand things better. So that's how I also like to make myself understand it, but also how I like to share it. So this is going to be a little technology here. So bear with me until you see my first slide.
Okay.
So systemic traumatology simply can be translated as, in a sentence, as the experience of trauma and how trauma resides in our bodies, remains in our bodies, or resolves in our bodies is very much dependent on the context of what event, at what age, in what situation we acquired something that traumatized us and left us with sometimes post-traumatic stress symptoms, or sometimes post-traumatic stress vulnerabilities, which would be not full-blown symptoms, but still a vulnerability to being to trauma experience flaring up that comes from a post-traumatic event somewhere in the past. And I'm showing you this first slide here, and maybe you can see that there are these little boxes, and they have lots and lots and lots of traffic between them. And this is a design that was made in the UK to depict all of the contributing factors to obesity. So this was about 15 years ago in the UK, and in those small boxes there, you have, and I'm coming a little closer so I can read it, they looked at how do the media contribute to this, how do social factors contribute to this, how do physiology and psychology contribute to this, and so forth. So there are numerous boxes, and all of these boxes show up in that place, and then they connect it, and it gets finer under themes, under for instance under psychology. And on the bottom there, I added a fingerprint and the sentence, "It's complicated." The sentence, "It's complicated," comes from many, many people, but most closely to me from my dear teacher and friend and colleague, Dr. Angwin St. Just. When somebody asks the questions about, well, how does this relate to this? Very, very often she will say, well, that's complicated. And then she'll go on to have a very interesting and captivating way of looking at it systemically. Why a fingerprint? Christy, your and my fingerprint, and the fingerprint of every one of our listeners and watchers, observers, each fingerprint is different, right? So each fingerprint is different. And what is so important about this image is that I looked and looked and looked and looked in all of these boxes, in all of these tiny little, I try to blow it up and find, do we see trauma in there? And we don't. So this big study in the UK that made good headway with many things did not include trauma as a source of the development, the developing of a body that is now called obese, and living in a large and heavy body. So in the late 90s, there was a big study with, I believe, over 25,000 people over a year's time, who answered and it was a study that was done specifically on obesity, but the questions about obesity were such as, when did it start? How does it fluctuate and so forth. And today this is known as the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And what they found in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study was that people who have physically been traumatized, be it through sexual trauma or other intrusive and physically overwhelming treatments like beating and other things, what they found was that people with obesity where they would lose some weight and then they would gain it back, or they would start being with the study and the remedy that the study was also offering, and then they would stay away, they wouldn't come back. And so most of the people who had this experience of or lived in a body that was considered medically obese had an experience or several number of experiences that where they needed the body shape and the body mass to feel safer and or to feel unseener.
Right.
And which then, of course, is also a measure of safety. So you can find that online, a study, and it's fascinating to read, because it's been one of the biggest things that opened up how many people in their childhood actually have experienced developmental early trauma, childhood trauma. And why the fingerprint? Why is it then, you can take all of these systemic things, but if you leave out the individual experience, there is a lack of being able to contextualize my experience, my personal experience, in the larger understanding of the fact that trauma is systemic. And let me go on with saying that the trauma per se has become a buzzword for a number of years. So this is traumatizing, and I've been traumatized by that, and so forth. And about a year or two ago, if somebody went to a store and could not find, and we were, debating what we were going to use, if we were going to use toilet paper or flour or whatever, could not find a good in a store, they might go to the next store and get it. But we are now hearing and experiencing stories where you have to go to 2, 3, or 4 or 5 stores. And even in one story, I read a woman in Southern California was going to 15 stores and could not find bottled waters.
Right.
Water, at which point that is a traumatizing experience. If you don't have drinking water in your house or in your place where you are, where you live. And so now things in this scenario that we all find ourselves in, we may have, globally, and then on this continent, and then nationally, and then in our community, and then in our home, it may very much differ but some things now may be traumatic that otherwise would have been relatively integrated growing up.
So can I just
Mhm.
come in for just a minute? So for example, what I'm hearing is if I grew up possibly in a home where there wasn't an abundance of food and or poverty, and then today with the coronavirus, for example, and I can't find certain food that at the grocery store, like sugar or flour, which has been a given for the last few weeks, not available. What you're saying is that experience itself is one of the systemic pieces tied to my own trauma. And so that would activate my system because of what happened as a child of not having enough food.
Well,
Is
and you
that
could
correct?
absolutely. So you contextualize what the experience is, and you think, you know, how does this relate? Has this happened before in some way? Does this
Right.
resonate with something that I know? Have you known this before? And we've started our conversation with you explaining and narrating and sharing with us that you did the systemic constellation work.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, training, and that when you look at contextualizing, and so do I, at contextualizing now, that you always also look at what about your mother? What about your
Yes.
mother's mother? Right?
Yeah.
And so people who are now going to a store and can't find food might actually be activated in that part of themselves that has a resonance with a generational trauma of, let's say, the Great Depression,
Exactly.
or let's even say the potato famine in Ireland. All of those is not that far ago that almost like echoes that might come back.
Yes.
Because many people now say this is unprecedented, this is unprecedented. Well, it's unprecedented to us. And even that depends how old we are.
Yes, it definitely does, Karen.
Right? People who grew up in the 30s in the Great Depression and the 29, you know, they're still alive. For them, that's not unprecedented. That doesn't mean they can deal with it better, because depending on how hungry they were, or how lost they were, or however, you know, how displaced they were, that might be very traumatic. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
And I talked with a friend last night. She has an 11-year-old son. He thinks this is absolutely fun. He gets to be home with his mom.
Yep.
He seems to love to cook. I never met. It's a distant. He cooks fancy meals for them, and on and on and on. I mean, he comes up with creative ways of making the best of this. For him, this is a kind of precedence, but one that at this moment he does not experience as traumatic.
Exactly.
And he's 11 years old. So that's where we need to just understand that a year ago, getting all bent out of shape over toilet paper might have been, with trauma, right? This is a traumatic experience, might have been interesting to explore what's behind that, because it didn't really make sense. The context didn't really make sense that it would have been traumatic.
Exactly.
Given context. Right now, there's still a question why toilet paper, but everybody chuckles about that, right? But if we go back to food or water, it becomes much more existential.
Yes.
Well, maybe toilet paper is existential, but it becomes much more, to me, it becomes much more, existential. To, is this going to end up in shortages that are even more severe? Are we going to hunger? Do we, etc.
Yes.
So let me. So now those concerns, or those freakouts or activations in the nervous system, upsets, anxiety, not sleeping, and so forth, make much more sense. Does that make sense?
It does make more sense.
Good.
Yes.
So trauma When people get traumatized, when there's a situation that traumatizes somebody, that means the situation was so overwhelming that their coping mechanisms in their nervous system, and their thinking about it, and their responding to it, and so forth, get overwhelmed. So think of a power failure on all levels. And a power failure on all levels has a traumatizing effect. The more helplessness there is, the more there is a chance of a post-traumatic stress, vulnerability, or actuality, symptomatic. So what trauma creates is broken connections. And it creates those broken connections to the self, to the other, and to the world at large. And you and I, because we do the generational trauma work, we also say, and across generations.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we are in a state of trauma, and you see that image, it is a little bit like a winter image that is opaque. So between me and my experience and the world, I might have something like an opaque glass, and I can't quite, I need to plug in my battery. I'm sorry, I forgot that this all gets very, very hungry for sustenance. Yeah, so we might have that between, you know, us and our inside as much as between us and the other person. So reaching out or being as joyful as somebody else, or finding anything interesting at all, etc. That can be a trauma state where it's like between my experience is so shut down and so withdrawn, that it feels like an opaque, the world is an opaque thing inside and out.
So someone that's, for example, so someone that might be locked up in their house and not feeling like they can go out, that's what I'm hearing, is there's an opaque, invisible glass, because they know that people are out there. They're aware that the world's happening, and yet they're stuck for safety. And so it creates a little bit of some type of confusion in the nervous system.
Well, and especially so if being stuck or not being allowed to leave or otherwise being locked up, which is not exactly uncommon.
So those kind of things that you just mentioned, yeah, those kind of things that you just mentioned, you said being locked up, not being allowed, that would be, again, an example of the systemic and present trauma, if that happened to them as a child. Is that correct?
Right. Let's say if the only way of parenting was go to your room now.
Yes.
Right? Yes, a child adapts. They, you know, they take a book or they take their tablet or something like that. But that broken, there's a broken connection created in some way. And so when that when that later happens, that might now feel as if that was coming back in some way, even if we don't make the connection.
That makes sense.
We might feel just as, and here is the word we spoke a little earlier about abandonment, you and I, when we prepared. If we only have, you know, a punitive approach to trying to discipline, right, to create help our children to obey something or to do something. If we only have a punitive approach, it tends to break the connection, right? We send them away, and then that's a kind of the reverse side of that is feeling abandoned.
Yes. Yep.
Often, I mean, not always. It's complicated, but there are generalities that work to a large degree, and then there are outliers of people with specific things, which is, you know, a little too complicated for now. But when somebody now sits at their home and feels like the world is receding, and they actually have no control over this, then that may not exactly be true, because now the door handle is still on the inside of as the on the inside of the door of the room. It's not on the outside. In all actuality, you still can walk to the door, open the door, and sit on your front stoop, at the very least. Or go out, or something like that.
So they do,
but
there is some power still.
Right, but our system might collapse into this old place of, I have no control over this. I'm stuck here. I have to stay in here until somebody comes, and we're not talking rational. We're not talking our capacity to think about it and make it rational. We're talking about an experience of being trapped.
Yes, which is very real right now.
Right. So when that happens, I just want to say that a traumatizing situation has that capacity to shatter. A huge trauma can shatter our worldview altogether. Why me? Why this? Why now? And where's God? If that's our worldview, right? Or it can fragment, and that's where I would bring, it can fragment certain parts into compartments, if you will, and we bypass those compartments so we can continue to survive and live and adapt.
Exactly.
And usually, and here's a little here's a photo I made of a little situation. I was in Sedona last September, and I was at a workshop, and it was the break, and I was sitting outside, and I was sitting at the roadside. There's gravel everywhere, and I picked up a stone and I put it down, and another one seemed to fit quite nicely, and then I continued to make a little puzzle there. And all the stones were there, and you can see I found some that molded themselves, and they are still not one solid piece, but they are in connection, in close enough connection, so they comprise an image of something that feels like a whole. And it feels to me, or I take it as a metaphor of what happens to us too. Even if we have certain parts that we develop, for the most part, we can show ourselves as a whole under most people, under most circumstances, can show themselves as a whole, even as they still have inner parts that are, more talented or less talented, or more courageous or less courageous, or more in a protective mode or more in an outgoing mode, those kind of things that have helped us as little people when we were growing up to become who we are today.
So it's a big part of adapting.
Right. So this piece snuggles up to this piece, and then that piece comes in, and that piece needs to have a little bump there, and so forth. And we go in the morning, we go in the office and look like a pretty complete person, right?
Yes.
But
we appear a certain way.
Huh?
We appear a certain way.
We appear, or we can also actually act a certain way and operate a certain way. We have what is called a window of tolerance to challenges.
Yes.
A functioning window of tolerance. Now increase the contextual impact like we're having now. So much is different. Yes, not unprecedented for the world, not unprecedented for history, not unprecedented for very, very old people right now, because they've went through similar situations maybe, and seen similar images. But for most people, the context has really amped up. It's like fire under a, under a pressure cooker.
Yeah, it
right?
is that.
And so what happens in this is that these parts, you might imagine they have they have rubber bands between them. That what is now you see as the black lines is sort of a rubbery consistence. Consistence? Yeah, right?
Yeah,
And
consistency.
consistency, thank you. And so when a pressure comes, it will tend to bring them apart, right? Let's say it's the pressure from within that brings them apart, and then their connection gets a little more tenuous. And this is what maybe happens now to somebody who usually is not a very angry person, knows they have a temperament, but has it under control pretty much for, the most part. And now they fly off the handle with everything. We have a fire that's increasing the pressure and stretching our bands of the parts of ourselves that we otherwise might have in a fairly fluid interconnection.
Right. And that certainly is happening right now, especially with people being home
mm-hmm.
with their children, their spouse, and or just being home alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of pressure that I would say most people probably haven't felt to this level, unless you're probably 65 and over.
Yeah, and come from another country, from another place in the world where you might have been a refugee 2 years ago and come out of a bombed out and totally destroyed town. So, your resiliency to 1, 2, 10, 15 empty shelves might still be adapted. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that it's great to have that adaptation, but there might be more room for the catastrophic end of things in terms of adaptation than for other people.
So if we understand, I feel like we have a better understanding of our elasticity and what that can look like. And the stones are a really good example of coming together and then being pulled apart depending on the situation. With that, Karin, the obvious question that would come up is, okay, now, well, what do I do with that? What do I do with that information? I understand myself better and why I might be a little more activated and or angry, maybe some depression or anxiety. So what do I do now? Is there anything available to me that I could bring a 10 down to a 9 or an 8?
Yeah, so let me get out of all of this and stop sharing so it's just you and me again. Yeah, so now what, right? Or what then? What when that happens? When let me just a sec. I want to have access to something here. It's from my perspective. So when somebody would ask me that, let's say a client calls and says, this is not a session, but what should I do? I don't want a session.
Exactly.
I don't want to process anything right now. It's like, okay. No, this is not the time maybe to do that. And already I've done it. Already I've done what is, I contextualized. This is not the time to do that. And I normalized in the same sentence. I said, this is a time that messes with all of us. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. I don't need to be your therapist. Maybe I have just an idea of, I don't know. When have you eaten last?
It's a good example, especially if you're overwhelmed. It's easy to forget to eat.
Or what are you eating? Yes,
that too. Carbs and sugar.
I'm totally out of my Skittles and I'm freaking out.
Yep.
Right? At which point there might be a conversation about more grounding food.
Yes.
Right?
And
less input in terms of some, or there might be a conversation about not just doing survival. I grab something when I think of it, but the pleasure of engaging, textures and colors and something and something and something, depending.
yeah, and maybe just sitting down and slowing down and having a meal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the piece too of even noticing when coming back into the body, to notice that you're chewing your food.
There you go, right? Slowing things down.
Yep, slowing things down.
Unless slowing down is so overwhelming, right? So not everybody, for instance, does well with sitting on a cushion and meditating.
Right, that can cause more activation.
Can cause more anxiety, can cause more physical activation, and if then you force yourself through this, it can actually be increasing the trauma load, if you will. I just made that up, but or maybe I didn't make it up, but that's just the word that comes to mind. You're increasing the trauma load on your system, whereas going for a walk.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe doing that, as Thich Nhat Hanh would have us do it on a very conscious walk. And again,
and mindfully.
Would not need to do it slow. You can also run, if you will, and do that very, 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 very consciously, hearing every time your foot hits the ground or some version.
This morning, I noticed that when I was walking, because I've had beautiful walks lately in the morning, and I really was conscious of my feet touching, one right after the other, how it was touching. And I was also making myself aware of my toes and relaxing them as I was walking, to as consciously bringing myself back into a body, because my intention was to relax and exercise at the same time.
Well, and I think the operational piece in here is to do something that brings you into the moment.
Yes, like Thich Nhat Hanh, that's exactly
right now
what he
in the
teaches.
moment. So right now, I'm touching this finger, 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 and I have not thought about toilet paper. Because in a way, I was concentrating. Now, we cannot do this all the time, but when the activation rises, coming into the moment, and sometimes it's this.
Yeah.
For some people, it's this.
And just touching the body.
Really making it real, and sometimes with holding on tightly, or with a very tender touch. And by using such interruptions for the activation, that can be a very helpful resource in our we called it a house apothecary, which is a direct translation from Haus Apotheke, from my German background, where you have those essential core things that will be needed for for helping in the moment, first aid, basically.
So how about, Karin, I think it would be helpful if we have a resource page that we can offer. Mm-hmm. And you and I can create that, and we'll load it on the page so it's available to everyone. Mm-hmm. And that way people can go in and see and just choose, oh, these are resources that might pull me out of being so activated. And they could choose one and see if it works. If it doesn't, they could try a different one. How would that be something that you and I could work together to offer everyone that's listening?
Absolutely. And I just want to say that it's going to be very simple. There's going to be a handful of them. Very, very simple to start. And then maybe it's also important to note that not every first aid item does the same thing for every person. So
Yeah,
for one person, it really might be calling a trusted friend because there's nobody in the house. And for another might be walking upstairs and finding somebody to say, would you have a moment to sit down with me?
exactly.
Does that make
So
sense?
let's,
So
it
again, we're
does.
always emphasizing what context is and what is help. But we will do a little sheet with our first, our first ideas that you have found anywhere else too. But it doesn't matter. The more we can do this, the better it is.
Yeah. So we will get that together and share it and load it up on the page under the files.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Karin, for sharing your expertise with us today. I certainly have a better understanding on a much bigger level of systemic trauma, let alone the little micro trauma, where it begins from, how that comes to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we will end it here today and catch up again, and we'll make sure all that is available for everyone.
Okay, and I think we discussed that we are aiming at visiting with you all on Sundays. Is that right?
Yes, that's where we'll load the videos on Sundays. Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much.
Karin. Thank you again.
Thank you much. Bye for now.